Picture your favorite crime show. True Detective, The Killing, Twin Peaks. How does it start? With a body, a female body specifically. She's usually young and beautiful and white. And as the show goes on, we're going to learn secrets about her that shock her friends and family and leave us guessing, who could have done this? Was it the weird ex-boyfriend, or the nice guy math tutor, or maybe she really did fall down the stairs? And we know what happens next. The cops come in, leads are pursued or dropped, and all the while we're glued to our couch adding up the clues, and at the end of the show we're like, of course, he did it. Well, that was me in the late 90s, and Law and Order was my drug of choice. There I was in my college apartment, 18 years old. I had basic cable and a secondhand couch and a scratchy rug from Pier 1, and I mostly ate Chinese takeout every night. But somehow, at the end of a long week, when I sat down on the couch and I heard that familiar bum 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 bum, right? I felt like a real adult. So why are these shows so addictive? There's a clear formula: a dead girl, a search for suspects, complications, and then an arrest. It's simple, and we know how it will end. So what keeps us coming back for more? Criminologist Scott Bonn puts it like this. He says we're getting fear and horror in a controlled environment where the threat is exciting but not real. Makes sense, but I think it's a little more complicated. Popularity of crime shows, also books and podcasts, it's at an all-time high. And yet, at the core of almost all of it is a woman problem. A big one. Sure, there is a woman in every episode, but typically we only meet her for a second as a dead body found in an alley. Her murder is what sets the show's plot in motion, but rarely do we come to learn anything about her as a complex character. She's the beautiful dead girl. Every show has one, and while the people around her, the cops and the lawyers, might talk up her beauty or her youth, it's the men on the show who we really get to know. We see the cop who's going through a rough divorce, who misses his kids, or there's the lawyer and his dingy apartment who has eczema on his feet. And then serial killers, always men, of course, they get entire series devoted to their emotional complexity. Anyone remember Dexter? Or Mindhunter, perhaps? But the victim, if we learn anything about her at all, it's simply that she was beautiful and white and often sexually active. The camera will pan in on her dead body, usually clad in some skimpy outfit, or sometimes we meet her naked on a slab at the morgue. The coroner might point out her wounds or how her teeth were knocked out, and the detective might look away. But we won't. We're seeing the victim through the perspective of the male gaze. We're objectifying her. At a moment when she can no longer speak for herself, we're letting the men around her tell us who she was. Whether we're slut-shaming her or blaming her for her poor decisions, we're othering her. That could never happen to anyone we know, we think. We don't look like her, or dress like her, or act like her. But what if it did happen to someone you know? In 2001, my childhood best friend Ashley was found murdered in her home in Hollywood, stabbed 47 times. She was 22 years old. I learned the news in my hometown paper in New Jersey. The story called her a talented artist and a gifted pianist and said she had recently transferred to fashion school. I was stunned. I was numb. I felt so many things at once. I had last seen Ashley about a year before she was killed. when she came to visit me at my college apartment in New York. We had lost touch a little bit at that point after her family moved to California during high school. As kids, Ashley and I spent all our time together. We were awkward, we were inseparable. We had sleepovers at her house and my house, and we would take art classes and play games of make-believe in the woods. But when I met her that day at the bus station, I barely recognized her. She used to be this playful misfit who wore baggy jeans and Gap sweatshirts and played piano duets with me at our 4th grade recitals. But now she was a different person entirely. She was super tan and skinny and had a push-up bra and a see-through top, and she had such confidence. She talked so fast. I, at the time, was a 3rd-year English major, and I assumed that Ashley was having a similar college life at the time, but instead she told me she actually wasn't spending much time in class. She was working as a stripper and also escorting, and there were guys who flew her out to meet them on set. There were actors, there were men paying for the lease on her Mercedes, and there was crystal meth, and there was so many details that after a while they blurred together into one. I was so confused and worried too, but I didn't say anything because I didn't want to sound uncool. All I knew is that Ashley appeared so much more sure of herself than I felt, and I wondered if our friendship had finally run its course. About a year later, she was dead, and I would spend the next 7 years replaying that weekend in my head as her case went unsolved. Consensus was it had to have been someone she knew, a violent strip club regular or an angry ex-boyfriend. I'd Google her name every few months and usually come up empty. But finally, in the fall of 2008, I learned an arrest had been made. His name was Michael Gargiulo, and he wasn't actually either of those things. He's an alleged serial killer who is being charged with 3 other murders and 1 attempted murder going as far back as 1993. He's still in jail awaiting trial over 10 years later, which is outrageous in its own right, but that's a different story. At the time, I was in my late 20s and I had been working as a writer and an editor for over 5 years, and I decided I wanted to turn my attention to writing a book about Ashley. I wanted to explore how your first childhood best friend can really shape your whole life, and I wanted to look at how for girls sometimes you shape your identity in reference to your friends as you grow up. And I wanted to look at how Ashley and I had started out so similarly and ended up in such different places. I started by trying to learn as much as I could about the alleged killer. I went to his hometown in Illinois and I poked around his high school and the site of his first alleged murder. And then I went to Ashley's strip club in Las Vegas and I drank an overpriced cocktail and chatted with the manager. After that, I requested her autopsy report from the LA County coroner, and I spent hours poring over the condition of her body. I was doing the work a journalist is supposed to do. I was requesting documents, following leads, trying to piece it all together. But there was just one problem. I wasn't actually learning about Ashley. It was like I was writing an episode of Law & Order without even realizing it. And I, too, had stepped right over a dead girl to do it. Only this time, it was a woman I had known. I was gobsmacked. How could I have fallen into the same crime show traps? I realized it had started with how I thought back to that last weekend between the two of us, how I took the salacious details she told me about her life and I assumed that they held the key to her death. I had made her into a stereotype. And I thought that by researching the background of the alleged killer, by trying to figure out what made him such a monster, I'd get closer to some emotional truth about Ashley's murder. But instead, I was elevating his perverted and misogynistic thinking, as if it was something I could learn from. I was making him the interesting one and not her. And I thought that by visiting her strip club, I would learn about a side of Ashley that I hadn't known and a lifestyle that fascinated and intimidated me. But instead, I was trafficking in the lowest common denominator and not learning anything new at all. I thought that by reading her autopsy report, I would come to have a visceral understanding of the pain and trauma that she had experienced. But instead, I realized I was looking for meaning in violence when there was none. I wasn't seeing Ashley at all. I had taken my complicated friend and turned her into a crudely drawn caricature. But this is what we all do. This is what we've been encultured to do when we mindlessly consume crime as entertainment. Needless to say, I knew I needed to take a totally different approach to my book, and so I threw out my first draft and I started again with a much different focus on the Ashley that I knew and how our friendship had shaped my life. Edgar Allan Poe wrote, "There is no more poetical topic in all the world than the death of a beautiful woman." He wrote that in 1846, and I'm not sure how much has changed. We are and always will be drawn to these stories, but when we let ourselves mindlessly get sucked in by formulaic drama, we're missing the bigger picture. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime tells us that 78% of homicide victims are actually men. But if we went by the stories that we saw dramatized on TV, we'd assume that most victims were women. And the CDC tells us that women of color are more than twice as likely to be the victims of murder than white women. But if we went by the stories we saw covered on TV, we'd assume that it was mostly white women getting murdered. Where are the stories we're missing? And while 3,000 women were killed in the United States last year, a far greater number, a whopping 1 of every 3 women, will experience sexual violence in her lifetime. When we zero in on cases of extreme violence and murder, we're missing the violence and trauma that is happening all around us that may not end in death, but is no less outrageous. So why does all of this matter? Because the stories we tell about women's lives matter. And the messages that we're internalizing about women when we watch these shows matters even more. Why does it seem like our culture will keep creating roles for women if and only if they are bound or gagged or tortured in some way? Now, more than ever, it is vitally important that we not lose our empathy for the female victim. And not pity and not sympathy, but true empathy. The identification with the feelings and experiences of someone who is not like us. And we as women can no longer allow men to be the point of interest in the stories of our lives and deaths. You know, these days when I think about Ashley, the details of her murder feel a lot less interesting to me than my memories of who she was as a girl and my dreams about the woman she never got to become. Would she have gray hair? Would she have children? A house by the beach? How would she have spent these last 17 years? How would she tell her own story? You know, I know that what makes for bingeable TV won't change, and that's violence and sex and mystery. And I know that not too long from now, you're going to find yourself sacked out on the couch watching CSI reruns. But I challenge you that when you do, Be mindful of the bigger picture and do not mistake violence for entertainment and formula for truth. Know that you are not seeing the whole story, but simply a shiny and sexy fragment and not the whole person. Be careful not to fall under the spell of the beautiful dead girl, because every time you do, you'll miss her altogether. Thank you.